Um, this work that you are doing is so important, not just to the whole church, but I'm thinking to me personally. I'm remembering how formative it was for me to be a lucky seminarian and taking that first and slightly aired trip to Tanzania. And on the occasion where our professor couldn't go with us, having to remember in my head all the ways in which we were reminded to enter prayerfully, to enter with community, to enter with spirituality, with a historic and cultural relevance to what was going on. And we made all the mistakes. I went on this trip my middler year with another Melanie. The two of us, one African-American, one European-American, equally short, one really outgoing, and that was the other girl, and myself, making all the mistakes, but doing it with well-being and intent and love. We came out the other side, but only after having offended people from one coast to the middle of the country and back again. And I think about how important it was not just to go on that trip, but the process of sitting with my priest counselor and spiritual director afterwards, and knowing that from that well of encounter, I would continue to find deep sustenance for myself, a place where I'd seen the face of God, and a recognition and a memory of the ways in which we pilgrim and sojourn together. When we do this work of community, of faith, of church building, we do it as pilgrims together. Whether you are lucky enough to walk with another person with your same first name, another Melanie or Maurice or Daniel, or whether you do it as we all do when we're really brave with strangers and unknowns, folks who we encounter along the way who have much to teach us about the world and ways in which we belong to each other. So I say this now, knowing that I get to bring you greetings. The journey ended pretty well, that I ended up not just finishing seminary and employed as a priest, but in the employ of our presiding bishop, Michael Bruce Curry, who's also taking us all on this pilgrim journey, this way of the Jesus movement, the way of love. But what Bishop Curry is hopefully bringing about in all of us is an understanding that it's not just a slogan, being life-giving, liberating, loving with one another, but we are reminding ourselves of the sacred path that we walk when we walk together. This pilgrimage way brings together all the things that the Jesus movement embodies, which fortunately I get to embody in my very, very, very long job title as the Director of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care. And I'll just share a few slides with you to sort of point you on the way. We get to embody all the parts of this perhaps unarticulated moment of the Jesus movement, being the people of God who are centered on Jesus, who follow him into loving, liberating, and life-giving relationship with God, each other, and the earth. Do you hear it? All the programmatic urgings, all of the great big movements for years through Executive Council and General Convention, all the ways we've called the church to help us into account and to do the work of creation care, of racial reconciliation, of justice, or shorthand, changing how and why we do church, mission, engagement, the how and why. And so in my little department that was started when I started, but now we've grown to about 6.5 people, we do racial reconciliation, care of creation. We bring up domestic poverty. UTO is a part of our group. Think about it. The monies of the UTO funds go to enacting the ways in which we're trying to do Jesus movement across the world. Social justice and engagement, all together. And you would not be wrong and probably wiser to me when you hear all these areas and think, wow, that's one job description. Who would do that? That's silly, right? And that's part of the ways in which I think God has called us as a church to live into all the tasks that this idea, Jesus movement, pilgrimage embodies. It's too big a task. It can't be done if we think in silos, if we think racial justice over here and little corners for Black, white, and Asian and Latino justice. If we think environment over here, poverty way down in a corner. it's too much work when we try to put it all into little blocks and keep going as things always have been. But what we're being called to do is to think about intersectional justice. The big word, big academic word, you probably hear it a lot, but thinking intersectionally about the ways our brothers and sisters and siblings in Christ and in the world are hurting are not in little silos. Some people don't have water. Some people don't have food. Some people are dealing with the historical legacies of oppression and segregation. But the fact that where one of us goes, we all go, that our liberation and our health and healing are bound up in each other. And that's our approach as Episcopalians to thinking about how we do justice in America and across the world, how we do the Jesus movement. And so here we are engaging in folks who are willing to do the Jesus movement outside of the borders, way beyond the place where they feel comfortable, the place where they understand all the answers, but the place where they're probably willing to go out and make all the mistakes, like I did on that first seminary trip to Tanzania, from coast to center of the country, willing to sort of ask all the hard questions. What does it mean to not think in silos? What does it mean to understand that the people you meet might be engaging in a lack, but also in a gift? That you yourself bring gifts and also wounds. What does it mean to think intersectionally? I want to offer that the great gift that I get to embody in all of these different areas is that it opens up a complicated story and it gives us a witness into a biblical way of walking this pilgrimage of justice with all of our neighbors. Now, we are often accused, Episcopalians, we're doing these things, we're engaging in sort of social do-goodism, where we're embodying the things that perhaps the ERD or United Way could do better, but we do them because of our biblical sensibility. Hold this story in your head for a minute. Think about in the book of Kings. Think about the prophets, the greatest prophet, Elijah, who was the one that embodied the hopes, the cares, the fears, and had this mystical connection with God on sure footing, could defeat evil, bring holiness every time. We're not Elijah. But think about the very next prophet, Elisha, the one that was a student, the one that missed all the great moments of history, that had to follow Elijah around, that asked for double helping, that reached up to the teacher in the whirlwind. I feel like perhaps me and the whole Episcopal Church might be in an Elisha moment where we're trying to gather what are all the tools we've learned from doing mission, from doing ministry, from doing justice, and are they enough to meet us in this time? Because this, and we must name it, is a challenging time. This is a time in which the communities we encounter want to be called by their own names, by their historical names, but also by the names that place them in community of the world in right relationship. So we think about places where for creation care and climate change, communities that are vulnerable, we call them frontline communities, because while we will all reap the effects and the pain of climate change, folks at the water's edge are on the front line. Folks without money reap them harder and worse than others. Get that? The idea of a frontline community. And so when we go out wanting to do service, to live and embody Jesus with folks who might be without, who lack, we are going from the safety to the front line. But what does that mean for us to bring our sense of intersectionality, privilege, confusion as we go from the safety to the edge of the storm? How do we do that in right relationship? How do we do that in the footsteps of those who were prophets and apostles and martyrs who followed a loving, liberating, life-giving God? How do we do that the way Elijah did if we're feeling a little bit like Elisha's? If we have to name that we are right now in 2021 at the end of a 18 plus month pandemic, sitting in a place where we're at the fulcrum of justice. We're right at the middle. We've seen protests, we've seen ups and downs, we've seen convictions, we've seen violence, we've seen hurt, We've seen the way people are missing and the way we ourselves are missing others. How do we name ourselves in history and give voice to historical silences? We own a lot of this. We are Anglicans in the Episcopal tradition, as you know. And so that's kind of why our church programs embody this. And you hopefully have seen a lot of the developments of our reconciliation and racial reconciliation programs, including the Becoming Beloved community now. This idea of a labyrinth that is purely an Episcopalian way into thinking about how we live in the midst of lots of historical problems, of injustice. And we like this labyrinth because it says we all come from different places. There's lots of ways in, there's lots of ways out, but there are some core tasks that we bring with us to all the other mission work we do. We always tell the truth. We speak, we confess the role of this church in racial change, oppression, and fostering change, and bringing people together. And that doesn't mean just if you're in Virginia, the place where American democracy and slavery were founded, but wherever you go, we live in a place that is calling out for truth. Can you tell God's truthful story wherever you are? We do the work of justice. We engage in just action. We reimagine the way the world should be. What could be happening here? Where are people hurting and what would be done to heal them? And we do these works of healing. We break free from oppression for the ways in which we bear wounds and our neighbors bear them as well. Is it internalized oppression? Is it colonialism? Is it something that needs to be dismantled in the way we understand our relationship to our neighbors, to our church, to ourselves? That labyrinth of racial reconciliation has global dimensions. It's not about just what's in America. It's not about just black and white, but it's about a way that we take fundamental tasks with us to be life-giving, liberating, and loving wherever we go, proclaiming God's dream. And there's been plenty of time for us to practice that here in these shores at home over the last year. And yet there's times when we have to ask the broader questions. How does this work across the world? So you might think, well, environmental work, creation care, well, that's just about gardens. It's about rain barrels. It's about carbon offsets. And yet, when we understand that the fact that we share a common soil, this narrow crust on top of the earth, unites us more than anything else, there's a privilege and a hope in that as well. We have found that talking about environmental issues, in fact, is a great uniter from red and blue, from black and white, from US and foreign soils. The fact that we share a common vulnerability, a common need to depend on the health of the earth is one place where we can breathe easy. We find that we make more friends than enemies when we engage the need for being reconciling with the earth. I love doing this here. If you think as Episcopalians, we have a narrow or perhaps not quite helpful or helpful view of creation care, I'm going to invite you to this quick little Episcopal quiz. An Episcopal quiz just to open our eyes to see what we have to offer here. So do you know you're Episcopalians thinking about the environment? What percentage of Episcopalians report that they have personally discussed climate change in their place of worship? Now, you know the stereotypes, you know the rumors. We're privileged Americans. We just like to recycle a few light bulbs. We're not really religious. We don't know the Bible. What's the percentage of Episcopalians that think about this? 24%? 90%? How about 70%? How about Episcopalians actually don't go to places of worship? Maybe they don't even log on. In fact, the answer is B. 98% of you Episcopalians discuss climate change at your place of worship or on your Zoom. What about this? What percentage of Episcopalians think water access should be a human right? And just so you know, we have an office at the UN. We talk about global human rights, but water access? 100%? 28% of Episcopalians? 80%? Maybe 98%? Okay, we're on a theme here. 98% of Episcopalians in a survey done nationwide across 15 plus denominations of Christians think that water should be lifted up as a human right. And finally, what percent of Episcopalians report they live in a place that needs to prepare? They know they need to prepare for climate change. They feel the vulnerability. 100%? About 72%. 5%, maybe 91%. I'm giving it away, but it's D again. 91 of us feel that we live on the brink. So we know perhaps a little bit of what it might be like for our siblings, brothers and sisters in the middle of the South Pacific whose island homes might be vulnerable. We understand, if we are asked to dig deep down, the vulnerability of folks who are worried about the air quality or whether or not St. Peter's by the sea in Florida is going to be St. Peter's in the sea. If we ask each other to tap into those feelings, we can help one another identify with our global Anglican brothers and sisters who are facing the front line. Remember that word? The vulnerability, so much more. Now, this is very important. And why I think we participated in the survey, but why it means so much to us as a church, as a denomination, as people doing mission or walking that pilgrimage. What percentage of Episcopalians report that their religious beliefs compel them to address climate change? I hope you are members of our Creation Care newsletters, Good News Gardens. You know we are busy, busy bees. We've got climate pledges and covenants. We're doing lots of work. But for all the thousands of Episcopalians that are signed in and keyed in some way, do you think they're doing it because of Jesus or the prayer book? Is there something in the Bible that compels them? Surely, you know the joke that we don't actually read the Bible. We hear the prayer book and think, well, that sounds a lot like that stuff you hear Jesus saying. But what do you think it is? 80%? Think about your average Episcopalian, 93%? They know the hymns, but do they know where the Psalms are without the prayer book? 50%, perhaps 12%. This should startle you and hopefully embolden you that 93% of the 1,000 Episcopalians that took this survey said it was because of their faith, because of the way they understand what Jesus is compelling them to do, because of the prayer book promises at baptism that motivate them to get involved with climate change. So think about this for a second. Just let it sit with you. It's because of the way that they pray, that they understand God's witness and revelation in themselves, in communities, and others, that make them understand that we have to do something, that mission is necessary, that engaging in the places of pain in this world must happen. This is pretty profound. That we as people, as prayer book people, as Anglicans on the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement are motivated and passionate about doing God's will, and where we see that the need and the hurt is flooding, or if we see that the hurt and the need is speaking about racial historical injustice, or if we see that it's colonial impacts or lack of equity and resources in the global 2/3 of this world, we are doing it by and large because of Jesus, because we said, I will with God's help. That's who we are. That's what we're doing. So that's why I think the intersection of these roles, this walk we're on, makes such good sense to us. We are not necessarily people who love silos. I think Episcopalians and the Episcopal Church are people who will get it. We get it, and I think that we found that this is our time. This is our moment when the whole world is asking, what does it mean for hashtag stop AAP I hate and Black Lives Matter? What does it mean? We're thinking about victories and defeats in courts over pipelines, over indigenous territories, but we're also looking at the incredible imbalance of COVID vaccines in countries across this world. We look at our ability to shift gears, to switch lenses, to hold so much of that intersectional pain within our understanding. It's pulling on a call for us, for this Episcopal Church, because I'm willing to bet that the next time we all get in person and go up to the UN and do some protesting about indigenous rights or working on COP at the climate conference of parties, when we start doing our protesting and advocacy, we will be able to speak to the lives, the hurts, the loves, and the needs of our siblings around the world in a very unique way. And I say this because I've seen global leaders' ears perk up when they go, oh, you Episcopalians, you're talking about carbon tracking. You're talking about local advocacy. You're talking about partnerships with churches here and churches in Haiti. There's something very local and specific about the ways you are walking that makes sense. And what you might be very proud to hear is that when folks in the UN ponder, well, governments can't do it. They haven't been able to stop climate change, and big NGOs, they produce a lot of research is good, but they haven't done it. But it's churches. It's people like you Episcopalians who get down at the personal, the granular level, the relational level that can show us how real change might happen. It might be bit by bit, partnership by partnership, but we can make this work. So that's where I find my hope and my joy at this moment, that we can walk together, not just on a plane pilgrimage. We all want to get on a plane and see what it's like. And perhaps I loved Bill's talking about, we used to bring a lot of clothes with us and pass them out when we went on our pilgrimages and realized that wasn't it. It's not that kind of pilgrimage that we're on. We're on an intersectional walk. We are on a path to redeem, reform, remake what it means to be in partnership with one another. And that's the core of what we hope this Jesus movement work of reconciliation, justice, and creation care would do. And I get an inkling that it's part of the charge for all of us, that you and your leadership in global missions are calling us again to rethink what it means to be partners walking together across divides, across barriers, to redo what it is, and to look honestly, to take the learnings that the 5,000 circles of sacred ground practitioners have learned, that we've got to tell a truthful and whole history, that there's so much more to the story, but that once we get to know how to tell that full story, we walk together so much better. And we can do it here, and we can do it anywhere with authenticity and humility and right relationships. So we have all these programs. There's a how to it. We are good at it. There's Zoom, and there's workshops, and there's sacred ground circles, and you can sign up online, and you could be a YASCer or an ESCer. We are very good at helping people embody and learn all the ways they need to bring that wholeness, that intersectional awareness in themselves. And yet there's a deeper why. It's that 98% in that survey again and again. I know that was a survey about climate change, but there's a deep why that's pulling us out of just reading the Bible and saying, I will with God's help when we get sprinkled with water, but to connect that to the witness and the will and the lives of those we walk with, those we partner with, those we visit, and those we create long-term relationships. I was about to cheer as I listened in on some of the workshops today and Tuesdays when I heard the phrase ABCD. It is another place in which the RJCC department under Bishop Curry are trying to equip the entire church to approach mission at home, abroad, everywhere. Because ABCD is about right relationships. ABCD is about learning to listen with and to the other, to walk together, to pilgrim. And it might not be far. It might be around the church block, but knowing the names of those you walk with, knowing what keeps people up at night, and knowing where their gifts and joys are. There's something about community that the ABCD pull is really striking a chord with Episcopalians. I can guarantee that I think more Episcopalians have done an ABC training of some kind than any U.S. denomination. We offer it free online. We offer it through ERD. There's a partnership that allows us to go out to your diocese, your mission group. We do it again and again because we're learning how to walk that pilgrims better. That way is important. It's a way that speaks to us, not just because it helps us do better charity work overseas, although it does. If you could listen to what people's real needs are, where their real gifts are, we go beyond bringing unwanted bags of clothes. You know that folks have ideas and hopes and dreams for their communities, but it transforms us as well. Richard Rohr just said the other day, when reflecting on what all of this 2021-20 change has brought us, is an understanding that perhaps we need a little bit less of folks who know all the answers and a little bit more of people who are transformed and can be in relationship. I think that's the core of that ABCDY for Episcopalians. We love taking the classes. Please sign up online. But we also know that there's something true about what God is calling us to do. It's not just about assets and community developments and knowing where a village has plenty of this and not enough of that, but there's something about the ways in which God teaches us to be resilient and to be connected across barriers, even when things are going wrong. So think back a little bit to that biblical prophet I brought up, Elisha the second runner, the inheritor of both privilege and brokenness, the one that probably didn't know if he could take the job on. Elijah had led the people, had done the magic. Elisha spent his formative years following in his footsteps, retracing backwards the freedom journey of the Israelite people as they were following God into liberation. He walked backwards in a state of memory, probably reverently, probably meaning well, but he wasn't there for the real thing. And as he walked backwards and held the scarf, this stole of gifts and power and privilege, wondering what the next step is, you might not remember this, but the very first miracle, the very first prophetic moment that Elisha was enacted with is right after Elijah goes. He walks back in the water. It's the water that surrounds the city of Jericho, where the walls came tumbling down. And he's not having a moment of power, but sitting on the banks of the waters is a whole community of people. A community of people who are in need. And they say that the water is poisonous. The water is not well. The water is not adequate. This water, this human right, this need, this vulnerable thing that could take homes from us, but also feeds our babies, we can't drink it. We can sit here and suffer and die, and that's what I think we'll do. It's inevitable. But Elijah, taking that stole, that prophetic moment, that teaching of those who walked in the past, following God out of slavery into freedom and following the prophet and those who came before, says, I think I know what we can do together here on this path. Go to your homes and get some salt. Get a bowl. He partners with community on his journey and says, the answer is in your houses. Go. And they go, and the people go back to their houses and they bring their own salt, their own bowls, such as they are. Elisha blesses it. Elisha prays over it. He gets the community to pray together. They pray always before and after, and they throw the salt of the gifts that the community has into that water. And then the scripture tells us in that little story, the water was made well. There's something about healing the natural resources of the earth that is so closely linked to healing the ability of communities that have been oppressed or is struggling without, focusing on inequity, or perhaps in the biblical version of colonialism, working with communities in partnership, being able to pray together and say, bring the salt from your homes, throw it in the well. And that's what happens. That the healing of the waters is linked to the healing of peoples, is linked to the ability to tell a historical story that rights a wrong world narrative, that takes people's hopelessness out, that writes them back into the story. It's not about great people over there or wonderful people from a rich country, but we were all on this journey, and we're sitting in places where the prophets stepped before us, and we are part of the story. And it's not about us. It's about you and I together. Pilgrimage in an intersectional justice fashion. weaves my story and yours and makes it big enough that we can say where the hurts were, where the water was poisoned, where people were without, where perhaps my grandparents and your grandparents caused pain to one another. But we tell and saw the places where the salt will help repair the breach, will help take the poison out, will help rebuild a new version. Takes from frontline communities the vulnerability and says, we can adapt, we can accommodate, we can have a just transition together, and we can find what that is when I listen to you, when I sit in your circles at the waterside. So I imagine that this work, this title, this department, reconciliation and justice and UTO and poverty, they seem all disparate. They seem very many, and yet they're all a part of the path, the way that we walk and follow Jesus, the way that we go back again and again and look at problems in this world and know that the first answer is not who has all of the answers and the facts, but who can first come with that ABCD mindset. Know my neighbor. Ask what keeps you up at night and what do you love? Where can I help you and where can I walk with you? What can you help me with? I always tell this story in our Call to Transformation, which is our Episcopal ABCD program online that you can enroll in at calltotransformation.org. And that the first time I realized that there was a unique and prophetic power and pilgrimaging with the folks that you want to serve. I was at my first call, my first parish, in the middle of a great downtown southern city, surrounded by 3 miles of underprivileged persons and public housing. And yet this wonderful, engaged, faithful, liberal congregation of mostly European Americans who were well off were struggling to figure out, why is our mission work not going so well in these nonprofit, these public housing communities? Why do we not feel the pull of community like we used to? And why is the programs that we're implementing not helping the kids stay in school? Why are we not seeing big changes in this neighborhood, the 3 miles around this little church? And so one day, a group larger than the church itself, the interfaith group of Richmond, Virginia, got together and said, a lot of us are thinking about these problems. So let's go on a trip. Let's go on a trip and see what else can be done. And so we put out the call, come with us, take a drive. Not that many of my lovely Episcopalians went, but I was the driver with my Baptist, my Methodist friends, my favorite rabbi, going up the road 3 hours from Richmond, Virginia to Baltimore, Maryland, to see another community like ours, where there was a ring, miles of public housing, people living in the bottom of the economic ladder, dealing with the long effects of racial oppression and segregation. And yet there was a school connected to churches and outreach programs that was sparkling. They were full of energy. There were grandmas knitting in the hallways, and there were dads and moms playing basketball. The children were singing. The teachers were rapping. It was a place full of hope and life, a well of water. And we thought, my goodness, that's amazing. How can we get that program back where our mission work is happening? Well, we thought about it and thought about it. And on the drive home, I was the youngest one, so I had to drive back. The Baptist minister tapped me on the shoulder and she said, little sister, can I ask you to deliver a message to the Episcopalians amongst you, to your Episcopal church down in the middle of town, and tell them that if they want to do better mission work, if they really want to be in community, if they want to actually embody the goals of this ABCD lifestyle they're proclaiming, they need to learn how to be better friends. You see, your folks, they got a lot of money, they have a beautiful church, they mean well, and yet what happens is they're really good at getting one single mom, one suffering undocumented person, inviting them over for the church coffee hour, sitting them in a chair on the stage and saying, tell us about your suffering. Tell us how sad your life is. Oh, how bad it is. We're going to feel guilty, but not mention it out loud. It's about you. But the thing is, we know that this is not what friendship is. This is not what relationship is. This is not how you walk together. Would you tell your Episcopalians that if they want to be partners and pilgrims and sojourners together on this path to remaking community in God's dream, to walk with us, to be friends, to share your sufferings and burdens, to not be about giving to, but being with. This wonderful Baptist deacon tapping me on my shoulder, giving me this message in charge for you and I and all of us, Episcopal Church. Walk together. How can we think now about new and deeper and more profound ways to be in community, to share our burdens, not be apart from or giving to, but to be listeners and also tellers of stories, of whole stories, of truthful stories, to be intersectional? I know we have it in us. We have the capacity. We have the charism to weave together our concerns for the poor and for the colonials, for the oppressed, for those who are on the front lines of climate change, for those whose jobs might be vulnerable to the changes in the economy, getting away from extractive markets like coal mining. We have it within our capacity, our Episcopalness, to look and know that we have a Jesus that we follow who redeems us out of the brokenness we might have lived into, knowing our communities might be the communities with Confederate flags that used to hang from the windows, or we might have pews named after generals who did terrible things to indigenous people. We might be in a place where we're spending all of our money to make sure that we have an endowment given hundreds of years ago by folks who perhaps lived a broken moral narrative, but we have within us now, in the model and example of the Jesus Christ who liberates all who are enslaved by sin and brokenness, to know the truth, to come out together, to walk together, children. We can tell the truth. We can listen. We can be intersectionally interwoven together so that we can hear the pains of others, that we can share where we are, that we can do mission and justice differently. Until we know that Jesus is probably sitting there in a frontline community, looking at the water's edge, coming closer and closer, we know that there won't be real change, but we bring with us that baptismal promise. Will you look at all human beings and know that they are loved by God? With God's help, we promised and said yes. And God's help never leaves us. So this is my charge to you. How can you help us? Help this Episcopal Church, help all these communities live in that intersectional reality, holding together enough capacity to be able to say, I understand the pressures of climate change. I understand the inequality of being from a country that used to be a major polluter and now needing the whole world to give up resources. To understand that I might have been a place that was the origin of colonialism, but I want to be in partnership and equity and friendship with folks who were on the receiving end of the brutality. We can build together, but how can we call ourselves to do it? Is it what you're doing now, encouraging more and more people to be in partnerships, to lay eyes on the ground, to know the names of their brethren and sisterin, be they in Tanzania and in Panama, be they in the Pacific Ocean? Is it about understanding the issues these communities face and about relating the ways in which we too are broken and where we too want to be on equality and equal footing with one another? How are you called to help us walk together to pilgrims and more perfect versions of partnership, to live that version of Jesus and the apostles together? We're going to walk together, children. But with Jesus' help, we won't get weary. So I hope we will all get together in mission and ministry worldwide to that great camp meeting in the promised land. And may all God's children say, amen.